It's Joe Mullings from 160 Studios in Delray Beach. And today joining me is Greg Lucier, who is the CEO of Corza Medical. Greg's 25 plus years in the medtech healthcare industry. Just an underachiever at Nuvasive. He was the CEO, current chairman. At CEO, he took it from $775 million to over $1 billion in revenue in just a few years. Also served as chairman and CEO of Life Technologies, a global life sciences company that grew in revenue from approximately $700 million to nearly $4 billion under his leadership. And earlier in his career included roles at corporate officer at GE, as an executive at GE Medical Systems as well. And Greg, welcome to the show.
Joe, great to be here. And just one minor tweak. I'm executive chairman of Corza Medical, and my colleague is Dan Croteau. He's the chief executive officer.
Got it. And Dan is an industry legend as well. So that is quite a team you've got going over there. And let's jump into that. That was a really, really nice roll up coming out of the GTCR family, which on the private equity side has been constantly building up a very substantial portfolio. So what was the impetus behind that, and bringing in Dan? That's a key teammate.
We've known Dan for years inside the GTCR family. He serves on the board of Resonetics, one of the great contract manufacturers that GTCR owns. And when it became known to us from Dan that the company he was running, Surgical Specialties, might be up for auction, we jumped into action. And we didn't just want to buy Surgical Specialties. We wanted to put some things together to start a larger surgical tools and technologies company. So coincidentally with Surgical Specialties, it came clear to us also that Takeda wanted to sell off one of their larger divisions that was doing these surgical hemostatic patches that stops bleeding in the middle of a surgery. And so we were able to close them simultaneously, create a business that's about $350 million in sales, very profitable. And Joe, for us, it's just a starting point to creating a, we think, quite unique new offering in the operating room against the Ethicons of the world.
And so, you know, we've got Godzilla and King Kong with Medtronic and J&J in that category, and you've got a great critical mass going. So taking on those two giants, you obviously see some gaps and opportunities there. What could you share with us that we may want to think about when taking on those organizations?
Well, you're right. They are Godzillas. They are giant. And most companies that have gone straight up against them have obviously hit a wall. At the risk of being a little Trumponian, I first have to put in my 2 cents that only in healthcare do you see this incredible, I think, non-competitive or anti-competitive aspect called the bundle. And it has really locked up that business and allowed these two behemoths to persist with very high prices in the industry. So I say that, and I just hope someday regulators get clear that they could bring healthcare costs down quite a lot if they applied the same rules that they do in every other industry into healthcare. But be that as it may, our strategy, Joe, without giving it all away, is to go where they're not. There is a boom going on in the outpatient surgery center area. They are not quick on their feet to get there. That is where we're going to be, and we are going to be absolutely laser-like focused on building our business out in the periphery of where we think care is going.
You know, it's interesting you say that on the ASCs. I've been chatting about that for the last 2 years. I think the ASCs is the next growth area in that decentralization of healthcare, that factory-like setting in the middle of town where you bring all your sick people. Clearly, we saw a weak spot in that and a liability in that, what we've just gone through over the last year. And the PE firms are moving into real estate plays on the strip malls that are empty. And the clinicians and the docs are realizing that they don't need to be business persons, but they could have business persons surrounding them. And that's interesting to roll a real estate play, a medical practice play, and a distribution play on the medtech, health tech side. It's going to be interesting to watch.
Well, it will be. And I would say one other thing to this mega trend you're talking about is that the incentives are also slightly different, and I think way more aligned to where the care provider, the medtech company, the owner of the real estate have much more of an alignment to have better efficiency than you're seeing inside hospitals.
Yeah, a friend of ours, Scott Hunnekins, we were sitting in a pub in Ireland a few years ago, and he looked at me and he said, no matter what you look at on the technology side of things, Joe, you got to run it through this filter of outcomes, value, and access. And moving forward, I think that's an interesting strategy on the ASCs and the access. And to your point, the J&Js and the Medtronic, not to pile up on them, can only be in so many places at a point in time, and especially if they're going to leverage the bundling strategy.
You got it.
Yeah.
And the bundle kind of breaks down when you move outside the big behemoth central hospital.
Yeah. So we've seen the decentralization occur in healthcare, and it was forced upon us by where we are right now with this pandemic and you know, wherever we are in it and whatever the other side looks like. Do you see the sales cycle reimagining itself from what we were in a analog to analog sale? And how does that declare itself in that lower tiered commodity marketplace?
That is the $64,000 question, is what happens now post-COVID with what has historically been a very expensive selling channel into healthcare, as we both know. Wearing my hat as the NuVasive chairman, we have not seen a demonstrable change in the desire of a spine surgeon to still want to have their rep right next to them in the middle of a surgery. So status quo there. I would say, though, putting my Corza Medical hat on, that you are seeing ever more the move towards consumerism like we see in our normal lives of ordering things. And I think that also greatly benefits a company that, much overused, goes digital and creates a lot of tools, capabilities that remove, not completely, but somewhat, the human in the channel and makes you a far more extendable business.
I want to propose something. You just brought up a very interesting point. Do you ever see the potential partnering with a Corza Medical type play with a distribution champion like an Amazon, where both parties, potentially the greatest supply chain distribution connected organization in the history of the world, potentially start to partner with more amenable players like a Corza downrange?
Absolutely. Further, you know, the interesting thing about the sutures business is obviously they are pervasive and omnipresent in everything you do. But the other interesting thing about a suture is it's the highest value item and the lowest transportation cost. And so it is just something that a distributor, a business like Amazon, really wants to have in the mix. And so that's why that, for us, that Surgical Specialties acquisition was so central to then put things on top of it, because it is such a centerpiece of where you want to go in the surgical tools and technologies area.
So we chatted about digital a little while ago, and it's fascinating. You know, I'm watching GTCR continue to grow. I'm watching KKR get into the CRO business on the acquisition side and the quiet roll-ups there with everything that's going on in this testing world that we live in. I don't think that's going to change much. Another conversation for another day. So we've had classic VC money that's been suppressed and actually been spent. We've seen some interesting fundraising by the large strategics. We've seen SPACs now come out. We've got, you know, what my latest list here is, I've got medtech acquisition from Karim Karti, the ex-COO of iRhythm, for $250 million. Compute Health acquisition with Omar Ishrak for $860 million. I think Bob Palmisano brought one out earlier in January for, I think Bob's was $200 or $250. What do you think SPACs are going to do to the market, and what kind of threat are they, and what kind of asset are they to the entrepreneur or the revenue player?
Well, this is a great question. You know, let's take the vantage point of the different participants in the question. You know, the public shareholder, I think, benefits from a SPAC. There's really not a lot of risk. You get a vote when they ultimately find a deal, and it's just not a bad way to park your money and potentially get a return, and to get a real return when you find a good business that you want to vote favorably for. So I think I understand the public investor appetite for a SPAC. I also think the SPAC is fulfilling a void that was, as you rightly point out, between VC and PE that is now bringing to public, and public shareholders have an opportunity to businesses that would normally have stayed private a lot longer. Now that cuts both ways. Maybe they should have stayed private longer, but nonetheless, let's go with the positive that they're getting access to entities that they couldn't normally have put money into. So I think that's also a positive. And then lastly, I think it's also a positive, believe it or not, for the PE folks, because they have a lot of portfolio companies. There are great valuations in the public markets. They didn't normally want to go public because it takes so long to go public. A SPAC is a fast way to access those public valuations, and you're starting to see more and more of that.
Mm. And it's interesting, too, because it is one of those investments, arguably, depending on who's in the SPAC, who the advisors are, you are betting on the jockey more than the horse in that SPAC design.
That is absolutely right. And that's why you see these big names behind them right now.
And then finally, on the SPAC side of things, you and I have grown up 30 years, and I think you maybe a few years less, but 30 years in medtech. We've been wrapped around the axle on the ICU, CCU, OR, cath lab environment and products therein that had ultimate oversight by the FDA. You're either a Class 1, Class 2, Class 3, you had clinical trials to go through, you had clearance or approvals. Health tech had, around the world last year, I think the number was $80 billion on the digital side invested in that. And a reasonable amount of that does not require FDA oversight, but definitely impacts access, value, and outcomes outside of the FDA purview. Do you see the SPACs potentially expanding that quite a bit?
Well, I do. I think these digitizations of healthcare that SPACs could potentially monetize are very interesting. But maybe taking your question and even going more broadly, and not to put in a commercial, but the other week I spent some time with the leaders of Bright Health, still a private company, a very fast-growing insurance company, and I was absolutely blown away by the digital tools they use to align the hospital, the outpatient, and keep people, patients, in the network, if you will, and therefore keep the economics good and actually lower costs over time. And they do it all through digital tools that the traditional insurance companies are not using. And so just another example of your question where this digitization of healthcare, connecting finally things that were always disconnected, is, I think we're just on the forefront of revolutionary change in the healthcare game.
Yeah, I think that Bright Health, you've got Amwell, you've even got a reasonable size of Teladoc.
Yep.
You know, I think the market cap of Teladoc puts it at like number 17 in the medtech industry, where it really wasn't on the map within a few years ago, within reason. So what do you expect out of the medtech, health tech market over the next few years? And then where does Corza Health, Corza Medical fit into that on whatever foreshadowing you can give us? What should we keep our eyes on with Corza?
I think there are two mega trends that we're playing to. This is very controversial, but this is Greg Lucier's opinion. The first is, I do think procedural growth gets checked to some extent as we get a lot more efficient about what procedures to do. Still will grow, but they will not be growing to the extent they once did, because I think we're going to get a lot more wise about who should get what. And second, I do believe at the unit economics level of a procedure, we're also going to see some compression. Not dramatic, but not an endless increase in procedural costs like we've seen an endless increase in tuition costs. It's just not going to continue. Those two trends are what we believe. And further, because the caregiver and the owners are going to be under that pressure as well, they're going to want to have a lot more custom service relationship that I think the big companies will struggle with. And that's where Corza Medical comes in. We're going to be incredibly digital, incredibly flexible, incredibly value-oriented, and service like 1985 Federal Express of positively overnight. I mean, this will be a business that makes it absolutely personal.
That's going to be really interesting to watch, and I love the transition going on across the entire landscape. Greg, is there anything I didn't ask you before we head out that you would like to share, or any insights? I know the industry always appreciates your insights. They're generally way ahead of the curve. Any thoughts before we head out?
No, Joe, I really appreciate your time, your listeners' time, and wish everyone the best.
I appreciate it as well, my friend. Thanks for taking the time out.
Thanks.
This has been Joe Mullings from 160 Studios in Delray Beach. Be well.